This is the Sea of Galilee, where so many of the events and the teachings of Jesus took place. But are those stories just myth and fairy tale and legend, or are they real historical events? The Gospels themselves record many details about particular people, particular places, and the activities that happened in this land. And that means we're able to test them. We can compare what we read in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with what we see in the land. Archaeology is not so much about proving the Bible. What archaeology does is it demonstrates to us that what we read in the Bible fits with what we know of the ancient world. The Bible is illumined by archaeology. Sometimes our reading of the Bible is challenged by archaeology. So come with me and let's take a look at some of the archaeology and see how well we can demonstrate the authenticity of eyewitness material that we can find in the New Testament. Well, here we are, deep underground in Jerusalem, and this is one of the ancient cisterns that stored water back in the period of the Romans. And so you can see how this massive cavity would have filled with water and provided water for Jerusalem all through the summer period. You can still see the plaster on the walls, though it's fragmenting in places and coming away. But this is, again, durable engineering from the ancient world, and a demonstration that Jerusalem as a city is layer upon layer upon layer, and we can go right down through those layers to discover these remains, these echoes of the ancient past. Wherever the Romans went, they would shape the land around them and leave their impression for us to discover, whether it's Hadrian's Wall in the north of England or the Colosseum of Rome, or here at Caesarea on the Mediterranean shore. King Herod would begin the development of this incredible aqueduct, would bring fresh water from Mount Carmel all the way down to this city by the sea. Now, as we explore the Holy Land, we can see location after location where the Romans, having come to occupy this land, would build magnificent constructions like this. And that all means that we can see the impression that was left on the New Testament world, the world of Jesus. Here we are on what looks like a mountain, at least from the distance, and we can see Jerusalem and Bethlehem on the hills beyond. But it's not actually a mountain. What we're standing on here is a man-made structure. Great King Herod built this. He reigned from 37 BC to 4 BC, and he built this as a palace, but also as a fortress. This is where he was able to survey across the landscape around Bethlehem, but he was protected because it was built like a fortress with its towers and with its walls, because Herod was a frightened man. We call him Great King Herod. But actually what we know from the Bible is he was great not just in building works, and we see many of those building works, that monumental architecture to this day in the land of Israel, but we also know him as great in cruelty. We hear about, from various records, including Josephus, some of the evil and cruel things he did. He would murder family members. He would murder not only enemies, but even his own leaders and generals. And that fits with what we know in the Gospels. We read in the Gospel of Matthew of his attempt to slaughter the children in Bethlehem when he heard of this child born to be king. King Herod is another of those great characters of the New Testament that we know a great deal about from outside of the Gospels. And what we find fits well with what we read in the Bible. From this position on the Herodion, you can see the commanding view. And this is where King Herod, back in 40 BC, won a significant battle against the Parthians. And that's one of the reasons that, having fled to Rome, when he returned here as an appointed king by the Romans, he chose this location to build this particular palace fortress. But this wouldn't be the only fortress that he built. Machaerus in modern-day Jordan, Masada not far from the Dead Sea, and of course in Jerusalem too. King Herod built these palaces partly as ways of protecting and hiding and securing himself because he had so many enemies. Here at Herodion we discovered just how dangerous archaeology can be. Ehud Nektar was excavating here, and part of his life's work was to try to find the tomb of King Herod. And then in 2007 he exposed these monumental ruins alongside a tomb and the broken fragments of a beautiful sarcophagus that have been restored and pieced back together. And they have revealed to us the final resting place of King Herod. Sadly, archaeology can also be dangerous work. And Nektar himself, excavating here just a few years later, was involved in an archaeological accident and was killed during a fall. That tells us something about the commitment involved in archaeology as we seek to unearth these ancient stories. Here at Herodion there was another great find. After the death of King Herod, this location was used by others who would seek to govern this area of Judea. And that would include Pontius Pilate. Excavations here in 1968-1969 discovered what didn't seem to be a very important little bronze signet ring. But only a couple of years ago it was announced that after cleaning, this bore a Greek inscription Pilato, meaning that it had belonged to Pontius Pilate, probably worn by one of his civil administrators. So this is another remarkable example of how archaeology provides direct confirmation for a personality that we read about in the Gospels. Here at Caesarea we see the Mediterranean Sea encroaching on what had once been a palace but then became the headquarters for a Roman governor. And in 1961 archaeologists made an astonishing discovery of a stone in secondary use as a step, and we can go and take a look at an inscription that connects us directly to a character from the New Testament. And here we have a replica of the inscription that was found. And we can see very clearly the name of Pontius Pilate, who was prefect of Judea. It's interesting that we read he was prefect of Judea. Later Roman historians would describe Pilate as a procurator. The Gospels describe him as a governor. Now the Greek word governor is much closer to the word prefect. And that tells us the New Testament writers really did have knowledge of what Pilate was doing at the time. This is authentic material from the time of Jesus. In this ancient landscape, you can almost hear the biblical stories come to life. This is the wilderness where Jesus would spend 40 days and 40 nights being tempted. This is the area where David would hide and take refuge. Now, the Bible calls this the desert, the wilderness. Geologists know it as a pocket desert, and it's genuinely a very arid and barren landscape. That actually can mean that traces of human activity can be sparse, difficult for the archaeological record. And yet, in and among the hills, there are some absolute riches of archaeological discovery, and they too cast light on the whole period of biblical history. The site you can see behind me is Qumran, And archaeologists have been excavating here for many years, and they've located a site that may well originally have been settled in the 8th century BC. It could be one of the cities mentioned in Joshua chapter 15. But at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a community living here. What archaeologists have found have included a scriptorium, a place where manuscripts were being copied. They found pottery manufacture, as well as a refectory and ritual baths and so on. Now the question is, what is the relationship between this site and the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves? The leading contender is a group of people called the Essenes. So what do we know of the Essenes? Well, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know a great deal. We know that this community had rejected much of the worship in the Jerusalem temple. They saw it as corrupt. And from these scrolls we discover many of their beliefs, their theology or philosophy. They had strong eschatological expectations of a final conflict, a separation between the children of light and the children of darkness, strong messianic views of a coming Messiah. Now, despite some fringe theories, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't provide us with direct reference to Jesus. Reference to a teacher of righteousness is almost certainly a leader of the Qumran community. But what the Dead Sea Scrolls do tell us is something of the thought world, the expectations, the ideas that were in the air at the time of Jesus. And it's into this world that Jesus came and Jesus preached. From the dry, arid deserts of the south, up here on Mount Arbel, we look in the north of the land across the beautiful Sea of Galilee. And here, of course, so much of the ministry of Jesus took place. We can see Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin. These are the places where the fishing boats would go to and fro. And this is the place where so much of the ministry and the teaching of Jesus took place. And the archaeology around this northern shore of the Sea of Galilee is bringing to light again so much of the world of the time of Jesus. Looking across the Sea of Galilee from here, it seems such a peaceful place. And when we read the Gospels in our imagination, we often think of this as a place of great tranquility. But we know that Galilee has always been very busy, with fishing and industry and commerce, tax collecting at Capernaum, an important trade route here. And so when Jesus taught the crowds, he taught people facing real pressures and real problems. In other words, he taught people like us. To really understand the world of Jesus, we are quite dependent on the New Testament. So we've come to Cambridge and to Tyndale House, where we can discuss with one of the foremost historians and scholars of the New Testament, Dr. Peter Williams, the reliability of the Gospels. What level of literacy was there in the first century? And in terms of passing this material on, were they more reliant on oral traditions?
What I would say is that everyone has access to writing in terms of they see it around. It's on the coinage, it's on the architecture. So it's not surprising if people have some passive ability to take things in. But that doesn't have to be the main way that teaching by Jesus gets passed on. With rabbis, often things were oral. But that doesn't mean oral and unreliable or oral and super memory, which sometimes people go those two routes, because actually Jesus chooses 12 disciples and their main job is to learn everything he says. He repeats himself. So each of the four Gospels records Jesus sometimes repeating things. They can hear him give the same or a similar talk on multiple occasions. They also then get to talk over it afterwards in their lesson with the rabbi. You can hear them sometimes discussing the meaning of a saying of Jesus as they walk along. What does this thing mean about rising from the dead? And so actually that's part of the whole way that the disciples receive things. And so it means it's not that we're asking them to memorize everything on the spot. Nor does the tradition only have to come through one person. It actually comes through multiple people because they've been taught for 3 years.
Do the four Gospels demonstrate that they rely on eyewitness evidence?
Well, to start, all the earliest manuscripts have the names Matthew, Mark, Luke and John on. And Matthew and John are of the 12 disciples. And Mark and Luke wouldn't really be well known if it weren't for the Gospels. So there's no motive for someone to stick the name Mark and Luke on those Gospels unless it's actually by them. Luke is said to travel with Paul in the book of Acts. He will say, we did this, and you can actually track some of his travels with Paul. Mark is said to be getting his information from Peter, who's a disciple.
Yeah.
When you just open up the Gospels and you look at almost any page, you could start asking yourself the question, what knowledge do the writers display? And clearly they display local knowledge of the place where Jesus was. So just when they mention towns, when they name geographical features and talk about where the land goes up and down and travelling times, they get all that right. They know Jerusalem, they know water bodies, they also know local customs. When they reference weather, they get it right. When they reference coinage, they get it right. Local weights and measures, dry measures, liquid measures, you can see those sorts of things. They know the local religious debates, who's who, the social stratification, the right sort of names for people. And that's happening across all four Gospels. It's a striking feature.
So what are the earliest known manuscripts of the New Testament?
We have manuscripts going back to the 2nd century for the New Testament, and people debate which precisely are the earliest ones. There are 2 of John's Gospel, one in Oxford, one in Manchester, which are amongst the earliest, and they are partial manuscripts, so they just have part of the Gospel. But it's a bit like auditing, where you go in and you check certain bits. The bits that we have fragments of stack up with what we find for the rest. And then we have more extensive manuscripts from the 3rd century and complete manuscripts from the 4th for the New Testament.
Archaeologists have been excavating here at Capernaum since the 1960s, and you can see in this typical black basalt stone the streets and the houses of the town where Jesus walked. Now, as an important location, this had a synagogue. It had a Roman garrison here with a centurion. We're not far from the coastline of Galilee, and also a trade route. This was an important place for the Roman Empire. The large church structure you can see on stilts behind me, that marks perhaps one of the most significant locations that's been found in Capernaum. In Matthew chapter 9 verse 1 we read that Jesus made his home here in Capernaum. Now, an archaeologist excavated here at Capernaum, they made this discovery of a room of a house that was being treated as special from the middle of the 1st century AD. This particular room was expanded. It was made into a small church, perhaps the earliest church in Christian history. And then eventually it became this more octagonal structure with a dome, perhaps a little like the Dome on the Rock that we can see in Jerusalem. Now, this Byzantine church structure was here for a reason. Why is it that going back to the middle of the 1st century AD, one particular house in Capernaum was being venerated as special? Well, that tradition suggests there's good reason to think this was the home of Peter in Capernaum. This is where Jesus made his home base in the Galilee. Jesus taught and ministered in the synagogue at Capernaum, and this beautiful white limestone synagogue stands at the position where we know the synagogue had been built by the Roman centurion who was based here with his garrison. But this is about 4th century, 5th century. It's a later Byzantine synagogue. And this beautiful white limestone, not quite the same as the black basalt that we know Capernaum was built from. So how do we know that there was a synagogue here at the time of Jesus? How do we know where Jesus taught? Well, actually, we can take a look down the side of the synagogue and see the evidence. But we can see here very clearly that it's built on top of foundations that don't quite align. The black basalt stone is the foundation of an earlier synagogue that would have been here at the time of Jesus. Jesus worked many miracles here. He taught here. He healed the man who had a shriveled hand. We know he healed the servant of the Roman centurion who helped pay for the building of this synagogue. The Galilee is volcanic, and that's why this kind of stone is the local stone that could be used for building work. We've just visited the first century town of Capernaum. And now as we're down on the lakeside, not far from Capernaum itself, we have to ask that question: what is it that draws all these crowds to visit this town? From all over the world, for decades, people have come. For most of them, it won't be the archaeological ruins. Now, what draws people is the magnetic personality of Jesus that continues thousands of years on to have such a draw for men and women. You know, there is something significant about the teachings of Jesus, about the miracles he worked, about the things that he said that connect to you and me all these years later. So, for all the interest in the archaeology, we can't lose sight of the intriguing man of Galilee who's made such an impact on the world. We're overlooking Magdala. This is by tradition the hometown of Mary Magdalene. And in 2009, archaeologists began to excavate what we now know is the first century town of Magdala. We have the synagogue with a beautiful image of the menorah inscribed on stone, along with evidence for ritual baths, fishing industry and commerce. The town of Magdala was destroyed by the Romans in AD 67 during the Great Jewish Revolt. The Jewish historian Josephus described its downfall when the Romans mounted a naval attack to get around Magdala's strong defensive walls, and many of its fishing vessels were sunk during the battle. Jesus said, "I will make you fishers of men." And many of the disciples of Jesus were fishermen by trade. We think of Peter and James and John. Not hard to imagine them plying their trade here on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's also not surprising that there's a great deal of archaeological evidence for that fishing trade. In fact, not far from here, at Kibbutz Ginosar, two brothers found in 1986 a boat that's been dated to the 1st century buried in the mud. After it had been excavated and preserved very carefully with chemicals, it was possible to understand the shipbuilding industry of the time of Jesus and have a very good idea of the kind of boat that Jesus would have sailed on at that time.
I think this is an interesting detail. When the Jewish tax collectors came to Jesus and the disciples to collect the half-shekel tax which every Jewish man was expected to pay for the upkeep of the temple each year, they came to Peter and he said, "Well, we don't have any money." And he went to Jesus and Jesus said, "Go and catch a fish." And in the mouth of the fish was a coin which was sufficient for the tax for Peter and his master. And that would have been a 1 shekel coin. Now, the authorities in the temple in Jerusalem required this tax to be paid in the silver coins minted in the city of Tyre. And this is such a one, with an eagle on this side, and Greek writing telling us that it comes from Tyre, and telling us that it was made in the year 18. On the other side is the head of the god of Tyre, the god Melkart. These coins were made of very high quality silver, so when the authorities in the temple melted them down, they had a better result. There you see the gospel narrative reflects the situation accurately. The coin was enough for both of them.
There was once a storm on this lake. We read about it in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus, in Mark chapter 4, verse 39, he rebuked the storm. He said, "Be quiet, be still." And we read that immediately it was calm and the waves were still. Now, I love archaeology, and I love the fact that we can find evidence for what we believe. But I know there are some things that go beyond the evidence. You can't prove that a miracle like this happened. But that's where faith comes in. Archaeology provides us with good reason to trust this eyewitness material. But by faith, we believe in its significance. You know, the disciples, when they saw that miracle, in Mark chapter 4, verse 41, they said, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Well, you know, I want to follow Jesus with my life because I've discovered that he is who he claimed to be, the Son of God. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. With these words, Jesus began the most famous sermon in history. Somewhere in this region, the Sermon on the Mount has gone on to impact lives and societies for centuries. Archaeology can help demonstrate so much of the reliability of the Bible, but it can't prove that Jesus spoke these words. The proof is found in the changed lives, the transformed people. You know, when I hear those words, I think of what impact that's had on my life and the lives of friends that I've known. And when I look back through history, I see how the words of Jesus have challenged societies and kings and emperors. Jesus has had an impact that has demonstrated his reality. In John chapter 13, verse 35, he said, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another." And it's that transforming word of Jesus that for me proves that he is who he said he is. Well, here we are in Beit Shan, or Roman Scythopolis. And if you look behind me, across the colonnaded street to the green hill rising up, this is an archaeologist's paradise. In that green hill, it's an ancient tell. There's actually the remains of 15 consecutive cities from the ancient world. Now that means this is a place that's seen warfare and destruction. We actually find in this particular tell remains that go back to the Canaanite period, and then to a period of very significant Egyptian control over the region. But then a significant destruction level from about 1150 BC. And the Philistines came to occupy Beit Shan. It was later that King David took this city and it became part of the Israelite kingdom. But then the Assyrians destroyed the city in 732 BC. And so it was that the story went on. But you know, if we look out from this tell, we can actually see the remains of the New Testament period. From the Hellenistic and then the Romans, this city was rebuilt as Scythopolis. So the remains around us are Hellenistic and Roman. Now this city was originally Hellenistic and then was redeveloped when Pompey captured this area for the Romans, and in 63 BC it became part of the Roman province of Judea. It's an important region. In the Gospels we read about Jesus entering into this region, but he never comes into this city. There are 9 other cities making up the Decapolis, a loose confederation of 10 cities in total. The other 9 are all on the far shore of the River Jordan. But here we are in Scythopolis. Now, why didn't Jesus come to this city? He passed by, but this would have been a pagan Roman city. This is a city that would have been distinct from the Jewish religious culture of Jesus. It casts a great deal of light on the contrast we have here between the Jews and the Gentiles, up close together, but divided. So you can see how this is an archaeologist's paradise with layer upon layer of ancient city. In fact, even beyond the time of the New Testament, this became a Byzantine city, and it was only destroyed in 749 AD by a massive earthquake in this region. You can see the broken pillars as a result. And then, of course, this city was abandoned to be lost, it seems, to history until archaeologists got involved.
Well, we're here at the southern wall of the Temple Mount, and archaeological excavations have revealed the staircase from the time of King Herod, which would have given access and exit from the temple itself. Now, you may have felt it was a little awkward when I was walking down the steps, and the reason for that is because this is a demonstration of Herodian crowd control. And from the period of King Herod, they knew how to control crowds. Thousands would have worshipped here at the temple. And in order to gain access or to leave the temple, as thousands would have been coming and going, these steps are deliberately designed, one wide and one shallow, so that it would slow down the movement, prevent a rush, a mass panic and injuries that could follow. Now, this is one of the few places where we can definitely say Jesus would have walked. You see the particularly eroded steps. These are from the time of Jesus, and we know that Jesus worshipped at the temple here. So we can actually walk on steps where Jesus walked here at the southern end of the Temple Mount.
Partly obscured by later building work is half a section of what was once a double gateway, which coupled to the triple gateway further down on the southern wall of the Temple Mount gave access and exit from the Temple Mount itself. We can be sure that Jesus would have passed through this doorway. This is part of the important way in which we know that the Jews at the time of Jesus, after a ritual bath in the mikvahs down below, would have then gained access onto the Temple Mount structure itself and come into the very presence in the courtyards of the temple. This is one of the Jewish mikvahs, a ritual bathing pool which was used for purification. And there's a division in the stairway so that you could walk down on one side and then walk back out the other side. And this would make you ritually pure then for entering into the environs of the temple. Now, on the day of Pentecost, we read about 2,000 people being baptized in Acts chapter 2. And sometimes people wonder, how on earth could you have baptized by immersion 2,000 people? Well, we know because of the mikvahs that there was plenty of water and capacity here for thousands to be baptized in a single day. And that was the origins of what we think of as baptism in the Christian church. So you're looking at a street here at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount with what would have been shops on the left-hand side, a great archway that extended out from Robinson's Arch down to the left-hand side of the street, and then these tumbled down stones that you see. These are the stones as they fell as a result of the Roman legion that Titus used to demolish the temple and the Temple Mount structure. It would have been an enormous job, but it was so important to the Romans to attempt to erase the memory of the Jewish presence in this city. Back in 1968, the street level was much higher than it is today. What you're looking at is a result of decades of archaeological work that has brought us back down to the layer that exposes the street from the time of Jesus. This is Herodion, and that means we have evidence now archaeologically for where the temple stood at the time of Jesus and for many of the events we read about in the Gospels. And if there's one bit of clinching evidence that we can see right by my side, it's this stone. This is a replica of a stone that originally was part of the top of the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. And it has an inscription from this Second Temple period that tells us this is the trumpeting stone. There is a little niche where one person could have stood, and because of the inscription we know that this is where they held the shofar, the horn, that gave them a call to worship as they blew the horn and invited the Jewish people to worship their God here at the temple. When I first visited this site, it was actually deep under the earth. A chance discovery in 2004 led archaeologist Eli Shukron to excavate what we now know is a mikvah, a ritual washing pool from the time of Jesus. And this is identified with the pool of Siloam. It's enormous. If it could be fully excavated, it would be the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools. And we know it was in use at the time of Jesus. In fact, in John chapter 9, we read a very interesting story where a man who was born blind was healed miraculously by Jesus. He put mud on the man's eyes and told him to go and wash at the pool of Siloam. When the man did so, he could see. That miraculous healing took place here at this very pool. This recently excavated Herodian street is actually a connecting road that would have led from the pool of Siloam up to the site of the temple. And this is a tunnel for us, but it would have been a street at the time of Jesus. So again, we are walking a road that with some confidence we can say Jesus would have walked. And certainly at the time of Jesus, this would have been a pilgrim's trail, a route to the temple. We're looking over this ancient Jewish cemetery here on the Mount of Olives. Still in use to this day. It's estimated over 70,000 people are buried here. But we know this is evidence of continuous Jewish presence in this land. There are graves here of relatively recent prime ministers and Old Testament prophets. And it's considered that for 3,000 years there have been burials in this region on the Mount of Olives. Here we are on the Mount of Olives with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem behind us. This is the place associated with anointment. In fact, the Talmud, the Jewish oral tradition, calls this the Hill of Anointment because these olives were used for anointing the king and the high priest. We read in 2 Samuel 15:30 that David came to pray here among the olive trees. And then famously, Jesus would often withdraw to this mount to pray. And this is where he came on the night before his crucifixion. And so for 2,000 years, Christian pilgrims have come to this place again to pray and to remember him. We're near the beginning of the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Grief. We can't say that this is absolutely where Jesus walked, but this is a trail which has changed a little over time, but marks various stations or points along the way as Jesus carried his cross. We move from the place of his arrest and his trial all the way to the site that marks the location of Golgotha and the place of the tomb where they laid the body of Jesus. Now, though we can't be absolutely sure of the route that Jesus took, and of course, actually the steps Jesus walked would have been somewhere below the level we're on now, there is still good archaeological reason to think that many of these locations are certainly first century, and they certainly reflect what we read in the Gospels. To the left of me, part of this wall is rebuilt on top of foundations of what was the Antonia fortress. Now, beyond this wall is the Temple Mount. And this fortress was built by the Romans to overlook the Temple Mount so they could see what was going on. And then as we follow the trail down, we will arrive at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And there's good reason to think that when Helena had this church built in the 4th century, it was because of good local traditions that understood and remembered that this was the site of the crucifixion and, of course, the resurrection. Not often you get to walk on the roof of a church, but here we are on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Behind me, the rotunda rises, which covers the area which we mark the tomb of Jesus, where they laid the body of Jesus, and the smaller dome by my side. This marks the chapel of St. Helena, so we're closer to Golgotha. This is the church that's very confusing to visit. A number of different denominations, church groups share the building, so there's lots of hustle and bustle. But we need to look beyond some of the religious structure to see we're in a very ancient site here. This is a church building dating back to the 4th century, built by Helena, the mother of Constantine. And there is good reason to think we're an authentic site. And you get more of a sense here of this being an abandoned Roman stone quarry. As an abandoned stone quarry, this is exactly the kind of location we would expect outside of the city walls for the Jewish people to use for burial, and even when the Romans overtook the city, to be used for crucifixion, execution. So that we're looking at a church building. Helena built it here for a reason in the 4th century. And when her Roman legion excavated what had been buried in the debris, she found a site that authentically fits with what we'd expect from the biblical record. There's good reason to think this was indeed the site where Jesus was executed, and then a little further along in the quarry, the tombs, which would include the tomb where they laid the body of Jesus. You can see here what we call the edicule, or the little house. And this small chapel, it essentially was built over the location of a rock-cut tomb from the 1st century. When Helena excavated this area, this was thought to be the tomb where Jesus had been buried. Now, we can't tell. It's been destroyed and rebuilt over many years. It's experienced its own levels of destruction. Archaeologists did do some restoration work just a couple of years ago, and it is very clear that inside that chapel there are definitely remains of a very early period tomb predating this Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, we're not going to go inside the edicule, but we can go and have a look at some tombs from the 1st century. Here is how we know that we're in an authentic site for burial at the time of Jesus. What we're looking at here are called kokim. This is a kind of tomb burial. So they buried in this area, and what they would do is they would place the body out flat so it would decompose over a year or two, and then place the bones in an ossuary, a bone box, which would be slotted into these niches, which you can see in the walls. So this was originally part of a whole area of tombs in this section of the abandoned Roman stone quarry. In Acts chapter 2, we read that Peter preached to the crowds on the day of Pentecost, and that would have been happening somewhere in the vicinity of these steps. And Peter preached on that day, reminding the crowd that they knew where the body of David had been buried. King David, he says in verse 29, died, was buried, and his tomb is still here to this day. However, Jesus, Peter says in verse 31, God would not let his body see decay. It used to be said by skeptics that Jesus, having been a crucified man, would not have been given a burial. Considered cursed, his body would have been thrown on the garbage and maybe burned to lime. In 1968, archaeologists found a bone box in Jerusalem from the 1st century which contained the skeletal remains of a crucified man. Yohanan, his skeletal remains showing how crucifixion was carried out, included the very gruesome discovery of an iron nail through his heel, which even had a piece of olive wood still attached to it from the cross on which he'd been crucified. So we can be confident that crucified people were given proper burials when people loved them and took care of their remains. Jesus, loved by many, would have been given a proper burial. But 40 days later, Peter could declare, we don't know where the body is. We know where the body of David is, but not far from here, the tomb where Jesus had been laid was empty. The bones were gone because Jesus had risen from the dead. We return to Caesarea and its artificial harbour, one of the earliest in the entire world. The Romans built this from the time of King Herod, and they used a type of cement that would set underwater. Amazing building technology. But we read in the Bible that it is here that Peter brought the gospel to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. And in Acts chapter 25, Paul was under arrest here before he would set sail for Rome. And so ultimately it is from here that the gospel would go to the ends of the earth. And we know, having explored this holy land, that many of the archaeological remains confirm that this gospel message was based on real history, and therefore it's a real Jesus who we speak of today, whose message has spread to the ends of the earth.